US President George Bush once called them the hope of the future Iraq. Now the so-called awakening councils are seeking a place in Iraq's security forces. What's the government plan to deal with them, and can it work? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. The US is touting them as a success story, but Baghdad is still cautious. Armed tribal militias, once fiercely hostile to the US presence, have now proved key in tackling al-Qaeda in the Sunni heartlands of Iraq. That change was attributed to the attempt by al-Qaeda to impose a very strict interpretation of Islam on the tribes. In spite of the important role they are playing, it seems that opinions are still divided about what part they can play in Iraq's future. Hugo McPherson has this report.
Iraq's Neighborhood Watch. The awakening council groups, armed by the US, are patrolling their localities in force. This man commands a force of irregulars in Baghdad's dangerous northern districts.
We have saved people from killers. The area is secured now, and all Muslims, Sunnis and Shiites can come to it. Thank God, we have secured the area.
Now these groups hope to be a national third force, operating beside the Iraqi police and the army. But Baghdad made clear Saturday that they don't want armed Sunni groups operating outside their authority.
We categorically reject that there will be basis for the neighborhood patrols. But the neighborhood patrols will become a part of our military forces working under the authority of the Iraqi National Unified Government.
The Iraqi government fears that power in the awakening group's hands will be power in the wrong hands. The awakening began earlier this year when the US kick-started a program to arm Sunni tribes for an important mission.
Our new strategy is designed to take advantage of new opportunities to partner with local tribes, to go after al-Qaeda in places like Anbar, which has been the home base of al-Qaeda in Iraq. This summer is going to be a critical time for the new strategy.
This summer saw al-Qaeda on the retreat. Dogged by bad news from Iraq, the US wants to trumpet the awakening groups as a success story. But the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad is not convinced. For them, autonomous, armed Sunni tribes raise the spectre of civil war further down the line. But it's still too early to know if this is a US gamble that will pay off for Iraq, or whether short-term gains against al-Qaeda will spell long-term sectarian disaster.
Well, joining us in our discussion today are our guests. In Amman, Yasser Qatarni. He is the director of the Regional Center on Conflict Prevention at Jordan Institute of Diplomacy. In London, Sabah Al-Mukhtar, an Iraq expert. He's also a lawyer. And in Washington, D.C., Professor Michael Hudson, Director of the Middle East Program at Georgetown University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Mr. Qatarni and Amman, if I could start off firstly with you. The U.S. calls the success of the Sahwa or Awakening Councils in Anbar province as a miracle. Do you think that that is a bit of an overzealous assessment, perhaps?
Indeed, I do believe that this is an overestimation of the amount of success that al-Sahwa managed to achieve so far. Let's not overreact to this successful operations that the al-Sahwa managed to achieve, because after all, we're still lacking an institutional and governmental umbrella that would maintain a long-term stability and security for the Iraqi citizens.
Mr. Hudson in Washington, D.C., do you agree?
Well, yes, I do. I think that the amazing growth of this movement or these groups, it's a little bit hard to know how unified they are, has happened so quickly that one cannot really be sure what political direction they might take or what their loyalties might actually be. If you're moving from, we hear estimates of from 60 to 80,000 fighters in these groups, with a possible increase up to 100,000, it seems to me very likely that you cannot be sure who is in these groups or what their intentions are or what in fact their loyalties will be, particularly if and when the Americans start to withdraw or to reduce the kind of subsidies that they're providing to these groups.
So what you're saying is that the government does have a point, even though the government is Shia dominated. Separate that from it. They do have a point that these Sahwas can turn into uncontrolled militias if their individuals are not completely merged with existing security forces.
Exactly. I think they have something definitely to worry about, because the government certainly is widely perceived as being highly sectarian in character, and the idea that these groups can be smoothly merged into the government security forces, which themselves are still in a state of flux, strikes me as quite a stretch.
Sabah al-Mukhtar, in the long term, do you think there'll be a horrible backlash over the Iraqi government's rejection of the Sahwas or the awakening councils and their hope to become legitimate government militias?
I don't think there is a problem in the future. It's the Americans are working on a repeat performance. They've gathered lots of people from militias, gave them the military fatigue, and they call them police and they call them the army, while in fact they are sectarian militias whose allegiance is not a national one, but it's to either their sect or tribe or their own people. And now they are repeating the performance with the other group to, in fact, balance or counterbalance the Iranian influence which the Americans see in terms of the police and the army. And the government in Iraq, which is based on the sectarian militias, itself sees that these forces are going to be forces that is a counterbalance, and it is going to jostle for power. That's why they are objecting to it. But I think in the future, at the end of the day, Iraq has been dismembered. Therefore, you have to accept the various factions in the country who are resisting the Americans. The idea that people, because they are against the Qaeda, they are with the Americans is an absolute disinformation and part of the American propaganda. You could be against al-Qaeda and against the occupation at the same time.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned that. In your opinion, what is the ratio between what you would describe as legitimate Iraqi resistance and what you would describe as al-Qaeda?
I think it is probably, in my view, it is 90 to 10. So there is 90% resistance and 10% what is called Qaeda, because I disagree with this idea that somehow there is a Rambo thing called al-Qaeda. This is a fiction which was created by the Americans, and it is being used to criticize anybody who is against them. It's very simple. Anyone who is against the Americans is called al-Qaeda, so everybody says they are bad, and Americans seem to kill only al-Qaeda. We don't hear of the Americans killing anybody who is not al-Qaeda. Anybody they kill, it doesn't matter, even babies, they seem to be considered al-Qaeda because they were killed by the Americans. I think it's a fiction, the idea of the Americans about the al-Qaeda in Iraq. There are militant Muslim groups who are fighting the Americans. Their agenda is Islamic. The force driving them is an Islamic one. They call them al-Qaeda. I don't know how they can distinguish between the various factions who are driven by religious motives as opposed to nationalistic or other motives.
Michael Hudson in DC, al-Qaeda, a fiction in Iraq created by the Americans. Do you agree?
Well, no, I don't quite agree with that. I think al-Qaeda has a lot of constituents, and there's quite a strong ideological current that has supported them. But I do agree that al-Qaeda is not and cannot really be totally a part of the resistance to the American presence in Iraq. What the Americans have apparently succeeded quite well in doing, at least in the short run, through this counterinsurgency strategy of, in effect, wooing away or buying off dissident elements, local elements, who have been treated rather badly by the al-Qaeda forces, seems to have worked rather well.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. How strong do you think is al-Qaeda? How strong are they at the moment? Do you think they are weakened, particularly after the death of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi?
Well, I think they've been weakened considerably. I don't know whether it was Zarqawi's death per se that caused that. I think I think they have handled their local relations rather badly. They appear to have been very militant and ruthless and extremist in a country that is not necessarily going to buy into that. So I think they've created a lot of mistakes. They've made a lot of mistakes and they've suffered for it. And now the Americans have, I think, quite cleverly seen that there is local resistance. And even though everybody, by all accounts, and this includes, by the way, Shiites as well as Sunnis, are opposed to a continuing American occupation, the local differences have been such that the United States, by the judicious application of counterinsurgency methods and money, have been able to raise this force. But I think it's a real question as to the loyalty of this force, and as the Americans gradually reduce their presence, will this force continue to do the job? I think it's unlikely.
Well, let's pose that to Yasser Qatarni. What happens if these Awakening Council members are not offered an alternative and they disband? Won't thousands of unemployed young fighters become ideal al-Qaeda recruits?
Well, definitely. If I may go back to the question of al-Qaeda and the resistance in Iraq, let's not forget that basically al-Qaeda usually, once they do face severe blows, they go into retreat and come back more forcefully and more powerful. And the Afghanistan is a case to be reviewed in this this field, in this regard. As for the al-Sahwa, I would basically agree with my colleague Sabah al-Mukhtar when he said that the Americans are repeating their approach that they have started with the Shiites at the beginning after the war, and now they're doing the same with the Sahwa by trying to forge a divide between Sunnis represented by the tribes and the nationalist groups in one part, and the al-Qaeda or the jihadist Salafis in another part. So at the end of the day, the question or the crux of the matter is still remaining in the field of occupation. So I don't see that this success is a long-term basically a plan that is happening right now in Iraq, and any retreat that we see currently by the al-Qaeda does not mean that they are strategically weakened as much as tactically reinforcing themselves, and properly recruitment among as-Sahwa members, if they do not see any fruitful results for their current campaigns, will definitely happen between them and al-Qaeda.
But are you saying that a complete US withdrawal and end to the occupation will solve all the problems, because this is the core grievance of all the resistance groups, whether al-Qaeda or not? What about others who'd say that a complete US withdrawal will just open up a can of worms and open Iraq up to more sectarian violence?
I would not say a complete withdrawal now is a solution. It's basically harming the current debate on the situation in Iraq if we only talk about an American withdrawal. The US, however, has a responsibility, huge responsibility, to support any international effort made by the international community to basically forge a compact that, an Iraqi compact that find an agreement among all local actors in Iraq and its neighbors as well. So the withdrawal is an element among others, and we need to make sure that definitely a complete and sudden withdrawal now is definitely will open the can of worm, and this is something that we should not ever allow to happen.
Sabah al-Mukhtar, you're shaking your head. I can see you disagree.
Well, in the first instance, the talk of the withdrawal is an academic exercise. The Americans are not withdrawing. They are building the largest bases in the world. They are building the largest embassies. This is not the intention of anybody leaving. Nevertheless, even if they were to leave, they cannot leave next day, because the Spaniards had 300 soldiers and took them 6 months to leave. So the Americans will take a long time to leave. But nevertheless, it still remains. departure of the Americans will solve the major problem, because at the present moment the existence of the occupation force is making it one of the militias. The Americans are teaming up one day with one Shiite group against another, one day with the Sunnis against the Shiites, once with the Shiites against the Sunnis. They are becoming one of the militias of that country. They are not playing the right role of an occupying force, as is recognized by international law. We've just seen the Americans going around spreading money, buying people clothes, because you don't buy allegiance. Allegiance is a principle. Either you have them on your side or you don't have them on your side. The occupation is the existence of the disaster, because it has imposed a government in Iraq which is representing the interest of the occupation, and with the occupation that government will have to go, and then the Iraqis will have their country to sort out. If we talk about a can of worm, if the present situation in Iraq is not a civil war, I do not know what a civil war is. At the present moment, the situation is so bad that each quarter of the city having to guard itself, having to have the neighborhood watch, and the Americans seem to be proud that there are less people being killed. Of course there will be less people being killed, because either they have been ethnically cleansed, in prison, or they are sitting within their compounds and the walls being protected by themselves. The problem lies squarely and principally with the occupation.
Mr. Hudson, do you feel that this relative success and drop in violence all over Iraq is just a temporary tranquilizer, and as Mr. Mukhtar has said, maybe due to the enormous troop presence, or do you think it's actually a serious gain?
Well, I don't think I would go all the way with Mr. Mukhtar in characterizing the situation as he did, or in characterizing the American intentions as he did. I think it is true that you cannot buy loyalty and legitimacy, but what you can do, at least in the short run, and this is what seems to have happened, is that you can buy some security. The Americans, who have made obviously many, many mistakes in Iraq, are calculating that if you can have a period of security, that will lay the basis for some kind of a political solution. Now, I think I'm not at all optimistic that this can of worms, which I agree is already very much open, is going to be closed very soon, whether the American withdrawal is quick or slow or partial or complete. I think the Iraqis are going to have to sort out who's actually going to run the country. But the American intention, I think, from the beginning is not as my colleagues have really described it. I don't think the Americans wanted to put in place a sectarian government. What we wanted to do was to put in place a new government that would be legitimate and would cover all of Iraq. And I don't think there was any intention to divide the country.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Well, now that things are divided mainly along sectarian lines, do you think the U.S. is actively encouraging the Iraqi government to help bring Sunnis within the power structures, or is the Bush administration happy with the status quo?
No, I think on the contrary, I think the Americans have been trying long before even the surge began to try and bring authentic Sunni participation into a government. But unfortunately, the government that we created is in fact dominated by a couple of Shiite militias and groups, which incidentally don't get along very well among themselves. And the result was that this government has been very resistant to allowing that kind of participation. This has been a very big miscalculation, I think, on the part of the United States. And I don't see a solution immediately in sight, because I believe that as these awakening groups move on, and as American support gradually diminishes, we will see indeed a period of bloodletting before some new third force, some centrist force among Iraqis can put things together. And I think I do agree that a lesser American presence, or even no American presence at all, will ultimately facilitate the establishment of a unified Iraq. But the Americans don't want just a unified Iraq. Obviously, the strategic interests of the United States call for creating an Iraq that is friendly to America's broad regional and global strategy. And that means an Iraq that will be friendly to Israel, an Iraq that will allow permanent American bases, and so forth. And I think getting to that point, even if you can put together a unified government down the road, getting to the point where Iraq can be like Iraq of the early 1950s under the Hashemites and under Nouri Saeed, that's a long time in coming.
All right, I want to bring in Mr. Qatarni. Sheikh Harith Ad-Dari, the head of the Association of Muslim Scholars, told Al Jazeera recently that the awakening councils, being US funded, have also been instructed to fight not only al-Qaeda but also other Iraqi resistance as well. How credible do you think that is?
I think there is a legitimate point in what Sheikh Al-Dari said. Basically, what I wanted to say actually is that the resistance is not merely a Sunni reaction to the occupation. Let's not forget that the Americans and the Iraqi government still have a problem with a large movement among the Shiite, and that is the Sadrists and their militia that is called Jaysh al-Mahdi. So that's why I usually feel that it is kind of misleading to claim that what we have basically in Iraq is something sectarian. I do not understand how come it is sectarian when we have Shiites fighting among themselves, the Skiris and the Sadrists as a case, and Sunnis now fighting against each other, like the al-Sahwa and al-Jihadists. I wouldn't call them only al-Qaeda, but the Jihadist Salafis in Iraq. So basically, in my personal opinion, what we currently have is a vacuum of power. And let's not forget that any war for liberation is basically a civil war in essence. So these
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I want to ask you about Iran. How active are they? I mean, surely they must have an influence in consolidating Shia gains since the fall of Saddam Hussein and the invasion of Iraq. How much influence does Iran have on someone like the Supreme Council leader, Abdulaziz al-Hakim, who's seen as a middleman between the US, Iran, and Iraq?
Well, at the end of the day, Iran has its own interest in Iraq, and of course it is very understandable when they work to consolidate these interests, and whether the instruments to consolidate these interests are Shiites or Sunnis. In my opinion, for Iranians it doesn't matter. It happens to have now the Skiris as their pawns in Iraq, but at the end of the day, I think the Iranians are very much engaged in the game in Iraq, and this is something that we should all understand. And it is the problem of the others who are not getting or stepping into the game in Iraq to themselves consolidate their own interest by creating or at least supporting the actors that who would join them in the field of the political process in Iraq at present.
All right, Sabah Al-Mukhtar, there's only a minute left on the program. Your final thoughts, sir. Have events not only recently but over the past 4 years shown that national reconciliation is quite unlikely in Iraq?
No, national reconciliation is very likely. The problem is that we have too many people putting their fingers in there. Everybody is trying to work on their own agenda. Iran is doing its own bit. The Arabs are doing their own bits. The Americans are doing their own bits. And everybody, the policy of divide and rule is not something new. It's been tried and tested by everybody. The Americans in their occupation in Iraq, this is exactly what they began with when they relied on the Shiite movements of Skiri and Badr. They knew they were Iranian instruments, but at the time they thought they can rely on them to dismantle Iraq and then control them, which I think this is what they are trying to do.
I'm going to have to interrupt you. We have reached the end of the program. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. In Amman, Yasser Qatarni; in London, Sabah Al-Mukhtar; and in Washington, Professor Michael Hudson. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts with us here on Inside Story, and thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on Inside Story. Bye-bye for now.